When successful attorney Usha Vance walked past the homeless teenager reading law books under a streetlight, she had no idea that one simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever. The girl's determination in the face of impossible odds would challenge everything Usha thought she knew about privilege, perseverance, and the true meaning of justice. But what Usha discovered about this young woman's past would leave her questioning whether she was the one who needed saving. And comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. The autumn evening air carried a crisp bite as downtown Cincinnati began its transition from the bustling energy of rush hour to the quieter rhythm of night. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting long shadows across the sidewalks where business professionals hurried past with their briefcases and coffee cups. The scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor mixed with the exhaust fumes of idling cars, creating the familiar urban symphony that Usha Vance had grown accustomed to over her 15 years practicing law in the city. Usha walked with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this world of power suits and corner offices. Her tailored navy blazer and polished leather briefcase spoke of success earned through years of dedication and countless hours spent poring over case files. At 42, she had built a reputation as one of the city's most formidable immigration attorneys, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to her clients. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her kind but determined eyes reflected the wisdom that came from fighting battles in courtrooms where justice didn't always prevail. The law firm of Morrison, Blake and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower that pierced the Cincinnati skyline. Usha had just finished a particularly challenging day, having successfully argued a complex asylum case that had kept her in court until well past 7. The victory was sweet, but the weight of responsibility she carried for her clients' futures never truly left her shoulders. Each case represented more than legal precedent to her. It represented lives, families, and dreams hanging in the balance. As she made her way toward the parking garage, Usha's mind was already shifting to the evening ahead. Her husband would be waiting at home with dinner, probably working on his own cases while keeping an eye on their 2 teenage children as they tackled homework. It was a routine that had sustained their family through the demanding years of building their careers, a delicate balance of professional ambition and personal commitment that required constant attention. The sidewalk beneath her feet was cracked and uneven in places, evidence of the city's age and the countless footsteps that had worn paths through its concrete arteries. Office workers streamed past in both directions, most absorbed in their phones or lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the familiar geography of their daily commute. The homeless population that had grown increasingly visible in recent years seemed to blend into the urban landscape for most passers-by, becoming part of the background noise of city life that busy professionals learned to filter out. But Usha had never been able to develop that particular skill. Perhaps it was her work with immigrants and refugees that had sensitized her to the vulnerability of those living on society's margins, or maybe it was simply the empathy that her parents had instilled in her from childhood. Whatever the reason, she found herself unable to walk past suffering without at least acknowledging it, even when she couldn't stop to help. It was this quality that caused her to slow her pace as she approached the corner where Elm Street intersected with 4th. Something had caught her peripheral vision, a scene that didn't quite fit the typical pattern of evening foot traffic. There, beneath the amber glow of a streetlight that had just buzzed to life, sat a young woman who couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old. The girl was positioned with her back against the brick wall of a closed storefront, a weathered cardboard sign propped beside her that read, "Anything helps. God bless." But it wasn't the sign that made Usha pause. It was what the girl was doing. While most people in her situation might have been holding out a cup or engaging with passers-by, this young woman was completely absorbed in a thick textbook that lay open across her lap. Usha found herself stepping closer, drawn by curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite name. The girl's clothing told the story of someone living rough, layers of mismatched garments that had seen better days, a worn backpack that seemed to contain her entire worldly possessions, and shoes that had walked far more miles than they were designed for. Her hair was clean but unstyled, pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested she took care of herself as best she could under difficult circumstances. But it was the book that truly captured Usha's attention. Even from several feet away, she could make out the distinctive formatting and dense text of a legal publication. The girl's finger traced along lines of text as she read, her lips moving slightly as she worked through complex passages. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, and she seemed completely oblivious to the foot traffic flowing around her. Usha felt her professional curiosity stir as she recognized the textbook. It was Constitutional Law by Erwin Chemerinsky, a dense, academic tome that she remembered struggling with during her own law school years. This wasn't light reading by any stretch of the imagination. It was the kind of text that required not just literacy, but a genuine understanding of legal concepts and terminology that took most students months to master. The evening crowd continued to flow past the girl without pause, most people averting their eyes or stepping slightly wider to avoid any potential interaction. A few dropped coins into a small cup beside the cardboard sign, but no one seemed to notice what she was reading. To them, she was just another homeless person, another problem that someone else should solve, another reminder of urban inequality that was easier to ignore than confront. But Usha couldn't ignore what she was seeing. Her legal mind began forming questions even as her heart responded to the incongruity of the scene. How had this young woman come to possess such an expensive textbook? Where had she learned to read legal text with such apparent comprehension? What circumstances had led someone with such obvious intellectual capacity to this corner, reading constitutional law under a streetlight while asking for spare change? As she watched, the girl carefully turned a page, her movements deliberate and reverent, as if the book were a precious artifact rather than a tool for academic study. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook and a stubby pencil, making careful notes in what Usha could see was neat, precise handwriting. The dedication was unmistakable. This wasn't someone casually flipping through pages to pass time. This was serious study, the kind of focused attention that Usha recognized from her most committed law students back when she had occasionally guest lectured at the University of Cincinnati. The contrast between the girl's circumstances and her aspirations struck Usha with unexpected force. Here was someone who clearly had dreams and ambitions that extended far beyond her current situation. Someone who was using what little resources she had to pursue knowledge that might lift her out of poverty. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be defeated by circumstances. Usha found herself remembering her own journey to law school, though the parallels were limited. She had grown up in a middle-class family where education was valued and expected, where books were plentiful and quiet study spaces were taken for granted. Her parents had sacrificed to pay for her undergraduate degree, and she had worked multiple jobs to help cover law school expenses. But she had never faced the kind of fundamental insecurity that this young woman was clearly experiencing. The girl looked up briefly as a group of college students walked past, laughing loudly about something on one of their phones. For just a moment, Usha caught sight of her face, high cheekbones and intelligent eyes that held a mixture of determination and weariness. She was beautiful in the way that youth is beautiful, but there was something else there too, a gravity that spoke of experiences beyond her years, As the students disappeared around the corner, the girl returned to her reading, but not before Usha noticed her glance longingly at their retreating figures. There was something in that look that spoke volumes about dreams deferred, about paths not taken, about the cruel randomness of circumstances that placed some people in lecture halls while others studied under streetlights. Usha realized she had been standing on the sidewalk for several minutes, her usual efficient pace home completely forgotten. Other pedestrians were beginning to flow around her, some shooting curious glances in her direction. She knew she should continue on to her car, return to her comfortable life and loving family, let this moment pass as so many others had before. But something about this scene had captured more than just her attention. It had awakened something deeper, a recognition that this chance encounter might be more than mere coincidence. The girl's dedication reminded Usha of why she had chosen law in the first place, back when she had believed that the legal profession could be a force for justice and equality rather than just a career path to financial security. As she stood there wrestling with whether to approach or continue walking, Usha began to notice other details that painted a more complete picture of the young woman's situation. Despite her obviously difficult circumstances, she had managed to keep herself and her few possessions relatively clean and organized. Her small camp setup was neat and unobtrusive, clearly the work of someone who understood the delicate balance required to exist in public spaces without drawing unwanted attention from authorities or hostile passers-by. The textbook itself showed signs of heavy use, dog-eared pages, highlighted passages, and margin notes that suggested serious engagement with the material over an extended period. This wasn't a book that had been picked up casually or recently. Someone had been studying this text for weeks or possibly months, working through it methodically, despite having no formal classroom structure or professor to guide the learning. Usha's professional experience had taught her to read people quickly and accurately, a skill that served her well in court and in client meetings. What she saw in this homeless teenager was intelligence, determination, and a kind of focused ambition that was rare even among her most successful colleagues. There was something almost magnetic about the girl's concentration, the way she seemed to create a bubble of scholarly quiet around herself, despite the urban chaos flowing past her on all sides. The autumn evening was growing cooler, and Usha noticed that the girl had pulled a thin jacket more tightly around her shoulders without looking up from her reading. The dedication was admirable, but also concerning. How long had she been sitting on cold concrete? When was the last time she had eaten a proper meal? Where would she sleep tonight? And how would she protect her precious textbook from the elements? These practical concerns began to compete with Usha's professional obligations in her mind. She had a family waiting at home, case files that needed attention before tomorrow's meetings, and a carefully structured evening routine that kept her complex life running smoothly. Getting involved with a homeless teenager, no matter how impressive her academic aspirations might be, could open doors to complications that Usha wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. But even as these rational thoughts formed in her mind, Usha found herself unable to walk away. There was something about this moment that felt significant, as if the universe had placed this young woman in her path for a reason that extended beyond mere chance. The girl's determination in the face of such obvious obstacles reminded Usha of clients she had helped over the years, people who had overcome incredible hardships through sheer force of will, and the belief that education and legal knowledge could change their circumstances. As she continued to observe, Usha began to formulate a plan. She couldn't solve all of this young woman's problems with a single conversation, but she could at least find out more about her story. Perhaps there were resources available that the girl didn't know about, programs for homeless youth or scholarship opportunities for promising students. At minimum, she could offer some practical help, A warm meal, information about safe places to stay, or even just the encouragement that came from having someone acknowledge her efforts and aspirations. The decision crystallized in Usha's mind, with the sudden clarity that sometimes came to her in courtrooms when she knew exactly how to frame an argument. She would approach the girl, not as a lawyer looking for a case or a do-gooder seeking to feel better about herself, but as one person recognizing the potential in another. Whatever happened next would depend on how the young woman responded to her offer of help, but Usha knew she couldn't walk past this corner without at least trying to make a connection. Taking a deep breath and adjusting her briefcase strap on her shoulder, Usha stepped closer to where the girl sat reading. The moment felt heavy with possibility, as if the next few minutes might change the trajectory of both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. As Usha took those first tentative steps toward the young woman, her mind raced through the countless ways this interaction could unfold. Her years as an attorney had taught her that first impressions mattered enormously, and approaching someone in such a vulnerable position required both sensitivity and respect. The girl was so absorbed in her reading that she hadn't yet noticed Usha's approach, giving her a few more seconds to consider how best to introduce herself without seeming intrusive or condescending. The streetlight above cast a warm glow that seemed to create an intimate study space in the middle of the bustling urban environment. Usha could now see more clearly what the girl was reading, a chapter on equal protection clause jurisprudence, one of the most complex areas of constitutional law. The pages were filled with case citations and legal doctrine that would challenge even advanced law students, yet this teenager was working through it with apparent understanding, taking careful notes as she went. When Usha was about 3 feet away, she cleared her throat gently. The girl looked up with startled eyes, immediately defensive in the way that people living on the streets learned to be when approached by strangers. Her hand instinctively moved to close the textbook, as if protecting it from potential theft or judgment. But when she saw Usha's kind expression and non-threatening posture, some of the tension left her shoulders. "I'm sorry to interrupt your studying," Usha said softly, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that had put countless nervous clients at ease over the years. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading Kemerinsky. That's some pretty heavy material." The girl's eyes widened with surprise. Most people who bothered to acknowledge her existence at all focused on her circumstances rather than her activities. Having someone recognize not just that she was reading, but specifically what she was reading, seemed to catch her completely off guard. She glanced down at the textbook and then back up at Usha, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of test or trick. "You know this book?" the girl asked, her voice carrying a slight hoarseness that suggested she didn't have many opportunities for conversation. Despite her rough circumstances, her speech was articulate and intelligent, with only the faintest trace of an accent that Usha couldn't quite place. "I do indeed," Usha replied, settling into a more comfortable stance that suggested she wasn't in a hurry to leave. "I'm a lawyer, and that particular textbook nearly drove me to distraction during my first year of law school. Professor Martinez used it for our constitutional law course, and I think I must have read some of those chapters 10 times before they started making sense." A small smile tugged at the corner of the girl's mouth, the first break in her serious demeanor since Usha had approached. "It is challenging," she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of the open page. "But it's also fascinating. I never realized how much the Constitution affects everyday life until I started studying it seriously." Usha felt a surge of recognition and admiration. This young woman wasn't just reading legal texts as an intellectual exercise. She was developing a genuine understanding of how law shaped society and individual lives. It was the kind of insight that Usha tried to instill in the young lawyers who worked at her firm, the understanding that legal knowledge carried with it both power and responsibility. "May I ask your name?" Usha inquired, consciously keeping her tone conversational rather than interrogatory. "I'm Usha Vance." The girl hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this well-dressed stranger with personal information. "Harper," she said finally. "Harper Sullivan." "It's nice to meet you, Harper," Usha replied, genuinely meaning it. "I have to say I'm impressed by your dedication. Constitutional law isn't exactly light reading, especially under less than ideal study conditions." Harper's expression shifted slightly, and Usha could see her trying to determine whether she was being mocked or genuinely complimented. The wariness in her eyes spoke of experiences with people who had approached her with false kindness before revealing other motives. But there was also hope there, the desperate hope of someone who rarely received acknowledgement for her efforts. "And aspirations. I know it probably looks strange," Harper said, gesturing vaguely at her surroundings, "a homeless girl reading law books. But I'm going to be a lawyer someday. I know it seems impossible right now, but I'm not giving up on that dream." The fierce determination in her voice sent a shiver down Usha's spine. She had heard similar declarations from law students over the years, but they were usually made in climate-controlled classrooms by young people whose biggest worry was whether they could afford the latest textbook edition. Hearing those words from someone studying under a streetlight, someone whose next meal wasn't guaranteed, carried a weight and authenticity that moved Usha deeply. "I don't think it looks strange at all," Usha said firmly. "I think it looks like someone who understands that education is the most powerful tool for changing one's circumstances. But I am curious, how did you come to have that particular textbook? It's not exactly something you'd find at a yard sale." Harper's hand moved protectively over the book again, but this time it seemed more reverent than defensive. "I found it," she said, then quickly added, someone threw it away. "It was in a dumpster behind the University of Cincinnati Law School about 6 months ago. The binding was damaged and some pages were loose, but all the content was there. I've been working through it chapter by chapter ever since." Usha nodded, understanding more than Harper might have expected. Law schools generated enormous amounts of discarded materials as students moved through their programs, and valuable resources often ended up in trash bins simply because they were outdated editions or no longer needed. For someone with Harper's determination and limited resources, such a discovery would have been like finding treasure. "That's quite a find," Usha agreed. "And you're studying it on your own, without any classroom instruction or guidance." "I have a library card," Harper explained, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "The main branch downtown lets me use their computers and access legal databases for a few hours each day. I've been supplementing the textbook with case law and law review articles. It's like putting together a puzzle. Each piece helps me understand the bigger picture of how our legal system works." Usha was genuinely amazed. What Harper was describing represented the kind of self-directed learning that would challenge even motivated graduate students. To be doing it while homeless, without the support structure that most students took for granted, demonstrated a level of commitment and intellectual capacity that was extraordinary. "That's incredibly impressive, Harper," Usha said, and she could see that the young woman recognized the sincerity in her voice. "But I have to ask, have you thought about actually applying to law school? There are programs and scholarships available for students from disadvantaged backgrounds." Harper's expression grew complicated, cycling through hope, frustration, and what looked like embarrassment. "I've looked into it," she admitted, "but there are so many requirements. You need an undergraduate degree first, which means 4 years of college that I can't afford. You need to take the LSAT, which costs money I don't have. You need letters of recommendation from professors who have never heard of me. You need a stable address and a support system and a dozen other things that seem impossible when you're just trying to find a safe place to sleep each night. The practical obstacles Harper outlined were very real, and Usha knew that each one represented a significant barrier for someone in her circumstances. But she also knew that where there was this much determination and natural ability, solutions could sometimes be found. The legal profession had mechanisms for helping exceptional candidates overcome financial and social barriers, though they weren't always easy to navigate without guidance. Those are real challenges, Usha acknowledged. But they're not necessarily insurmountable. There are community college programs that can provide a pathway to a 4-year degree, and many law schools have programs specifically designed to help non-traditional students. The key is often finding the right people to help navigate the system. Harper looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Are you saying that as someone trying to make me feel better, or as someone who actually knows about these things? The direct question caught Usha off guard with its perceptive honesty. Harper had clearly learned not to accept easy reassurances from well-meaning strangers, and she was demanding real information rather than feel-good platitudes. It was exactly the kind of sharp, analytical thinking that would serve her well in legal practice if she ever got the chance. I'm saying it as someone who has worked with the legal education system for 15 years, Usha replied honestly. I've seen students overcome incredible obstacles to become successful lawyers. It's not easy and it's not guaranteed, but it's possible with the right combination of determination, support, and strategic planning. As they talked, Usha began to notice details about Harper that painted a more complete picture of her situation. Despite her obvious poverty, she maintained a dignity and cleanliness that spoke to personal pride and self-respect. Her few possessions were organized and well cared for, suggesting someone who understood the importance of making the most of limited resources. Most tellingly, her focus kept returning to the textbook as if it represented not just current learning, but future possibilities. The evening foot traffic was beginning to thin as office workers reached their destinations and the dinner crowd took over the sidewalks. The temperature was dropping noticeably, and Usha could see Harper pull her thin jacket more tightly around her shoulders. The practical realities of her situation were becoming more apparent as night approached. Where would she eat? Where would she sleep? How would she keep warm and safe during the hours when the city belonged to different people with different intentions? Harper, Usha said carefully, I don't want to overstep or make assumptions about what you need or want. But I am wondering if you'd be interested in grabbing some dinner and talking more about your goals and maybe some concrete steps toward achieving them. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both women understood. For Harper, it represented the possibility of human connection and practical help, but also the risk of dependency or obligation. For Usha, it meant stepping outside her carefully structured life to engage with complications she couldn't predict or control. Harper studied Usha's face carefully, clearly trying to read her motivations and trustworthiness. Why would you want to do that? She asked finally. You don't know me. I'm just some homeless girl you happened to see reading a book. You're not just anything, Usha replied firmly. You're someone with obvious intelligence and determination who's working toward meaningful goals, despite facing challenges that would defeat most people. As someone who believes in the power of legal education to change lives, I'm interested in learning more about your story and seeing if there might be ways to help. The honesty of the response seemed to resonate with Harper. She closed the textbook carefully, wrapping it in what looked like a plastic bag to protect it from the elements. Her movements were deliberate and thoughtful, and Usha could see her, weighing the decision carefully. There's a diner about 6 blocks from here, Harper said slowly. Nothing fancy, but they serve decent food and don't hassle people like me as long as you order something. If you're serious about talking, we could go there. I'm serious, Usha confirmed, adjusting her briefcase strap and preparing to walk. And Harper The meal is my treat. I'm not expecting anything in return except honest conversation." As they began walking together down the sidewalk, Usha felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty about what she was getting herself into. Her rational mind catalogued all the reasons this was potentially complicated. She knew nothing about Harper's background or history. She had family obligations waiting at home, and getting personally involved with someone in such difficult circumstances could lead to situations she wasn't prepared to handle. But her heart told her this was exactly what she was supposed to be doing. In her years of practicing law, she had learned to trust her instincts about people, and everything about Harper suggested someone worth investing in. The girl's combination of intellectual curiosity, personal resilience, and unwavering commitment to her goals reminded Usha of why she had chosen law in the first place, the belief that knowledge and justice could transform lives and communities. The walk to the diner gave them a chance to continue their conversation in a more relaxed setting. Harper pointed out landmarks and shared bits of information about navigating the city that revealed both street wisdom and genuine affection for Cincinnati, despite her difficult circumstances. She spoke knowledgeably about local politics and recent court decisions, demonstrating that her legal studies extended beyond textbooks to real-world applications. "You really love this stuff, don't you?" Usha observed as Harper explained her thoughts on a recent Supreme Court decision that had been in the news. "I do," Harper admitted, her face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "I know it might sound naive, but I believe the law can be a force for justice and equality. I've seen how the system can fail people, especially people like me, but I've also seen how it can protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable when it works the way it's supposed to." The sophisticated understanding Harper displayed was remarkable for someone her age, particularly someone without formal legal education. She grasped concepts that took many law students months to internalize, and she applied them to real-world situations with insight that impressed Usha. Whatever Harper's background and circumstances, she possessed the kind of legal mind that could make a genuine difference in the profession. As they approached the diner, Usha found herself increasingly convinced that this chance encounter was going to prove significant for both of them. Harper represented the kind of potential that the legal profession needed more of. Someone who understood justice not as an abstract concept, but as a practical necessity for protecting society's most vulnerable members. The question was whether the system would prove flexible enough to recognize and nurture that potential, or whether the barriers Harper faced would prove insurmountable despite her exceptional abilities. The diner's neon sign flickered to life as they reached the entrance, casting pink and blue light across the sidewalk. Through the windows, Usha could see the familiar scene of working-class diners everywhere: vinyl booths, laminated menus, and the promise of hearty food at reasonable prices. It wasn't the kind of place where she normally conducted business conversations, but somehow it felt exactly right for this particular discussion. As Harper reached for the door handle, she paused and looked back at Usha with an expression that combined gratitude, hope, and lingering wariness. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's been a long time since anyone wanted to hear about my dreams instead of just seeing my circumstances." The warmth of the diner enveloped them as they stepped inside, a welcome contrast to the cooling autumn evening they had left behind. The familiar sounds of clinking silverware, quiet conversation, and the gentle hum of the coffee machine created an atmosphere of comfort that seemed to help Harper relax slightly. The hostess, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked up from her station near the register. "Table for two?" she asked, her gaze taking in the unlikely pair, the professionally dressed attorney and the young woman whose appearance clearly marked her as someone living rough. But there was no judgment in her expression, only the practiced neutrality of someone who had worked in diners long enough to understand that every customer had a story. "Please," Usha replied, and they were led to a booth near the back of the restaurant, away from the main flow of traffic but with a good view of the room. The red vinyl seats showed their age, but were clean and comfortable, and the table bore the scratches and coffee rings that testified to thousands of conversations that had taken place across its formica surface. Harper slid into the booth with careful movements, still clutching her wrapped textbook as if it were a lifeline. She placed it beside her on the seat, her hand resting protectively on the plastic covering. Usha noticed that despite her obvious hunger, she could hear Harper's stomach rumbling quietly. The young woman's eyes kept darting around the restaurant, cataloging exits and assessing the other patrons with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. The waitress approached with 2 glasses of water and a warm smile. Her name tag read Dolores, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been serving customers for decades. "What can I get you ladies to drink?" she asked, setting down the waters and pulling out her order pad. "Coffee for me, please," Usha said. "Harper, coffee would be great," Harper replied, her voice still carrying that slight hoarseness. "Thank you." As Dolores walked away to retrieve their drinks, Usha opened her menu but found herself watching Harper instead. The young woman was studying the prices with the intense focus she had applied to her law textbook, clearly calculating what she could afford, despite Usha's earlier assurance that the meal was her treat. It was a habit born of necessity, the automatic mental arithmetic that people living in poverty develop to survive. "Harper," Usha said gently, "I meant what I said earlier. Please order whatever sounds good to you. Don't worry about the cost." Harper looked up from the menu, conflict evident in her expression. "I'm not used to accepting charity," she said quietly. "I know that might sound strange coming from someone who was sitting on a street corner with a sign, but the money people give me, that's different. That's exchange for something, even if it's just making them feel better about walking past. This feels like charity, and I've spent the last year learning to survive on my own." The distinction Harper drew revealed a sophisticated understanding of dignity and self-reliance that impressed Usha. Even in her desperate circumstances, the young woman was thinking about the psychological and social implications of accepting help. It suggested a strength of character that would serve her well in whatever path her life ultimately took. "I understand that perspective," Usha replied carefully. "But what if we think of this differently? I'm a lawyer who occasionally mentors young people interested in legal careers. You're someone with obvious potential who could benefit from guidance and information about navigating the system. This could be a professional consultation over dinner rather than charity." Harper considered this reframing, and Usha could see her testing it against her internal standards for acceptable help. "A professional consultation," she repeated slowly. "That would mean you'd be getting something out of this conversation too." "Absolutely," Usha confirmed, and she realized it was completely true. "I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've become somewhat removed from the passion and idealism that brought me to the profession in the first place. Talking with someone who sees legal education as a path to justice rather than just career advancement reminds me why I chose this field that has real value." This seemed to satisfy Harper's concerns about maintaining her dignity while accepting help. She relaxed slightly and turned her attention back to the menu with genuine consideration rather than anxious price-checking. When Dolores returned with their coffee, Harper ordered a burger with fries and a side salad. Not the most expensive item on the menu, but clearly something she genuinely wanted rather than the cheapest option available. Usha ordered a grilled chicken sandwich, and then settled back in her seat, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. The familiar ritual of a working dinner was something she had experienced hundreds of times over the years, but this felt different, more personal, and potentially more consequential than most business meals. "So tell me more about your background," Usha said, as they waited for their food. "How did you become interested in law, and how did you end up in your current situation?" Harper took a sip of her coffee, seeming to savor both the warmth and the caffeine. "Those are two very different stories," she said with a slight smile. "The interest in law came first. When I was 14, my family was evicted from our apartment because our landlord was illegally raising rents and intimidating tenants. We ended up staying in shelters for a while, and I watched a legal aid attorney help my mother fight the eviction. Even though we didn't win, we couldn't afford to stay in the unit even at the legal rent. I was fascinated by how the law could be used to protect people who didn't have power or money." Usha nodded, recognizing the origin story that many public interest lawyers shared. Personal experience with injustice often provided the motivation that sustained attorneys through the challenges of representing vulnerable populations. "That must have been a formative experience," she said. "It was," Harper confirmed. "I started reading everything I could about tenant rights and housing law. The librarians at our local branch helped me find resources, and I discovered that legal research was like solving puzzles. You had to find the right pieces and put them together in the right order to build an argument." "And what about the second story?" Usha asked gently. "How did you end up homeless yourself?" Harper's expression grew more guarded, and she stared into her coffee cup for a long moment before responding. "My mother had addiction issues," she said finally. "She tried to get clean several times, but she kept relapsing. Child services was involved on and off throughout my teenage years. When I was 16, she disappeared completely, just left one day and never came back. I aged out of the foster system before they could place me anywhere permanent, and I've been on my own ever since." The matter-of-fact way Harper relayed this information spoke of someone who had processed trauma and moved beyond the emotional devastation to focus on survival and future goals. But Usha could hear the underlying pain in her voice, the grief of a young woman who had been forced to become an adult far too early. "I'm sorry you went through that," Usha said, meaning it deeply. "But I'm also amazed by your resilience and determination. Many people who experience that kind of instability struggle to maintain focus on long-term goals." "The law was what kept me sane," Harper replied. "Even when everything else in my life was chaos, I could lose myself in legal research and case studies. It was like having a parallel world where logic and justice mattered more than the random cruelty of circumstances. Studying constitutional law especially helped me understand that the principles of equality and due process were designed to protect people exactly like me." Their food arrived, and Harper attacked her burger with the controlled hunger of someone who wasn't sure when her next meal would come. But even while eating, she continued the conversation, demonstrating the kind of intellectual engagement that Usha associated with her most promising students and colleagues. "What's your ultimate goal?" Usha asked as they ate. "Beyond just becoming a lawyer, what kind of practice do you envision?" Harper's eyes lit up with the same passion Usha had seen when she was reading under the streetlight. "Housing law," she said immediately. "I want to represent tenants and fight slumlords and work on policy that makes decent housing accessible to working families. I've seen how housing instability affects everything else in people's lives: education, employment, health, family, stability. Fix the housing problem and you can address a dozen other social issues." The specificity and sophistication of Harper's vision impressed Usha. This wasn't a vague dream about helping people. It was a carefully considered career plan, based on personal experience and systematic analysis of social problems. Harper had identified a specific area of law where she could make a meaningful impact, and she understood the connections between housing policy and broader social justice issues. That's exactly the kind of focused approach that makes for effective advocacy, Usha said. Have you given thought to the practical steps required to get there? I know we touched on this earlier, but I'm curious about your specific plans. Harper pulled out her small notebook, the same one Usha had seen her using to take notes while reading. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, lists, and what looked like carefully researched information about educational pathways and requirements. I've mapped out several possible routes, Harper explained, flipping through the pages. The traditional path would be community college for 2 years to get my general education requirements, then transfer to a 4-year university. For my bachelor's degree, then law school. That's probably 6 to 7 years total, assuming I can maintain good enough grades for scholarships and financial aid. Usha was struck by the thoroughness of Harper's planning. Despite her difficult circumstances, she had done serious research into the educational requirements and timeline for legal careers. What about alternative paths? She asked. There are a few states that still allow people to become lawyers through apprenticeship programs or by studying law independently and then taking the bar exam, Harper said, consulting her notes. California has the most established program. You can study under a practicing attorney for 4 years and then sit for the bar without going to law school. But finding an attorney willing to take on that kind of apprentice is extremely difficult, especially for someone in my situation. The level of research Harper had conducted was remarkable. She had clearly spent significant time investigating every possible pathway to her goal, weighing the pros and cons of different approaches with the analytical skills of an experienced legal researcher. Her notebook contained contact information for various programs, scholarship opportunities, and organizations that assisted non-traditional students. What about immediate steps? Usha asked. What are you working on right now besides self-study? I'm trying to get my GED first, Harper replied. I was a good student in high school, but I had to drop out during my junior year when my mother's situation got really bad. The testing fee is $60, which doesn't sound like much, but it's been hard to save up while covering basic survival expenses. $60. Usha spent more than that on lunch at the upscale restaurants where she often met clients. The contrast between Harper's carefully budgeted survival and her own comfortable lifestyle hit Usha with unexpected force. Here was someone with extraordinary potential whose progress toward meaningful goals was being blocked by the cost of a standardized test that represented mere pocket change to most professionals. Once I have my GED, I can apply for financial aid for community college, Harper continued. I've researched the programs available, and I think I could manage full-time classes if I can find part-time work that's flexible enough to accommodate my studies. The challenge is that most employers want a permanent address and references, which are hard to provide when you're homeless. The practical obstacles Harper faced were interconnected in the way that poverty created cascading barriers to advancement. Without stable housing, finding employment was difficult. Without employment, accessing education was challenging. Without education, improving her long-term prospects was nearly impossible. It was the kind of systemic trap that kept intelligent, motivated people locked in cycles of poverty, despite their best efforts. Harper, Usha said carefully, what if some of these immediate barriers could be addressed? What if the GED fee wasn't an obstacle, or stable housing could be arranged, or someone could provide the references and support needed for employment and educational opportunities? Harper looked at her with a mixture of hope and wariness. Are you saying you might be able to help with those things? She asked. Because I need to be honest. I've learned not to count on promises from people who want to help. too many people. Mean well but don't follow through, and getting my hopes up just makes it harder to keep going when the help doesn't materialize. The honesty was both heartbreaking and admirable. Harper had clearly experienced disappointment from well-meaning people before, and she was protecting herself emotionally while still remaining open to genuine assistance. It was a survival strategy that demonstrated wisdom beyond her years. "I'm saying I'd like to explore what's possible," Usha replied honestly. "I don't want to make promises I can't keep, but I do want to investigate what resources might be available. I know people in the legal community, and I have connections with organizations that help promising students overcome financial barriers. At minimum, I think we could address some of the immediate obstacles like the GED fee." Harper studied Usha's face carefully, clearly trying to assess her sincerity and capability. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "I know you said this is a professional consultation, but helping with practical things like housing and expenses, that goes beyond professional mentoring." It was a perceptive question, and Usha found herself considering her motivations carefully. Part of it was certainly professional. She genuinely believed that Harper could become an excellent lawyer and contribute meaningfully to the legal profession. Part of it was personal. Harper's story reminded her of why she had chosen law and inspired her to engage more actively with social justice issues. But there was something else too, something harder to articulate. Harper represented the kind of person the legal system was supposed to serve and protect. Her determination to use legal education as a tool for helping others embodied the highest ideals of the profession. Supporting her wasn't just about helping one promising individual. It was about investing in the future of justice itself. "Because I believe the legal profession needs people like you," Usha said finally. "People who understand from personal experience what it means when the system works and when it fails. People who see law as a tool for justice rather than just a path to financial success. And because sometimes the universe puts someone in your path who reminds you of your own obligations to use your privilege and resources for something meaningful." The answer seemed to resonate with Harper, who nodded slowly as she processed Usha's words. "If you're serious about helping," she said, "I need you to understand that I'm not looking for a handout. I want to earn whatever assistance I receive, and I want to be able to pay it forward someday when I'm in a position to help others." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Usha replied, recognizing that Harper's pride and work ethic were essential, parts of what made her special. "Any assistance would be an investment in your potential, not charity, and the expectation would absolutely be that you'd use your eventual success to help others facing similar challenges." As they finished their meal, Usha found herself thinking about the practical next steps that could help Harper begin moving toward her goals. The immediate needs were clear: stable housing, income, and educational opportunities. But the longer-term challenge would be navigating the complex systems and institutions that controlled access to legal education and professional opportunities. The conversation had revealed depths to Harper's character and capabilities that went far beyond what Usha had initially observed. This young woman possessed not just intelligence and determination, but also the analytical skills, ethical framework, and practical wisdom that would make her an exceptional advocate for others. The question was whether the barriers she faced could be overcome quickly enough to capitalize on her potential before circumstances forced her to abandon her dreams. As they sat in the comfortable booth with empty plates between them, Usha felt the weight of possibility settling around their conversation like an invisible current. The diner had grown quieter as the dinner crowd thinned, leaving mostly shift workers grabbing late meals and a few couples sharing dessert. The soft lighting and muted conversations created an intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage deeper sharing and honest planning. Harper had relaxed considerably during their meal, her shoulders losing some of the defensive tension that had marked her posture when Usha first approached her on the street. She sat with her notebook open between them, pages filled with carefully researched information about educational pathways, scholarship programs, and legal career requirements. The organization and thoroughness of her planning continued to impress Usha, who recognized the analytical mindset that would serve Harper well in legal practice. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding immediate barriers," Usha said, pulling out her own leather portfolio and uncapping an expensive pen. "Let's make a concrete plan. What would need to happen in the next 6 months to get you on a stable path toward your goals?" Harper consulted her notebook, flipping through pages that contained what was clearly months of careful research and planning. "The GED is the most urgent priority," she said. "Without that, I can't apply for any formal educational programs or most employment opportunities. The testing window for this year closes in December, so I need to register and take the exam within the next 8 weeks." Usha made notes as Harper spoke, her legal training automatically organizing the information into actionable items and timelines. "What's involved in the registration process besides the fee?" "I need a permanent address for official correspondence," Harper replied. "The testing center won't accept general delivery or post office boxes. They also require photo identification, which I have, and completion of a pre-registration workshop that covers test format and study strategies." The permanent address requirement represented another of those interconnected barriers that made escaping homelessness so difficult. Without stable housing, accessing services became exponentially more complicated, creating a catch-22 situation that trapped people in cycles of poverty despite their best efforts to improve their circumstances. "What about housing?" Usha asked. "Have you looked into transitional programs or assistance for young adults aging out of the foster system?" Harper's expression grew complicated, cycling through frustration and resignation. "There are programs, but most have waiting lists of 6 months or longer. The few emergency placements available are usually reserved for people with children or those fleeing domestic violence situations. Single adults, especially young adults who are technically capable of working, are lowest priority for most assistance programs." Usha found herself getting angry on Harper's behalf. The system seemed designed to penalize exactly the kind of self-sufficiency and forward thinking that Harper demonstrated. Someone who was working to improve their situation through education received less support than someone who had given up entirely, creating perverse incentives that perpetuated rather than solved problems. "What about employment?" Usha continued, working through the practical necessities systematically. "You mentioned that most employers want permanent addresses and references." "That's been the biggest challenge," Harper admitted. "I've tried applying for retail and food service positions, but most applications are online now, and they automatically screen out anyone without a permanent address. The few places that still accept paper applications want work history and references going back several years, which I can't provide because I was focused on survival rather than building a resume." The conversation was revealing the extent to which modern employment systems, designed for efficiency and risk management, inadvertently excluded exactly the people who most needed opportunities to improve their circumstances. Harper possessed intelligence, work ethic, and communication skills that would make her valuable to any employer, but the gatekeeping mechanisms prevented her from even getting interviews. "What kind of work would you ideally want to do while pursuing your education?" Usha asked, already thinking about connections and possibilities within her professional network. "Something that would give me exposure to legal work," Harper said immediately. "Even if it's just filing and basic administrative tasks, being in a law office environment would help me understand how the profession actually works day to day." But I'd take any legitimate work that would provide steady income and accommodate a class schedule. Usha paused in her note-taking, struck by an idea that was simultaneously obvious and potentially complicated. Her firm regularly hired temporary and part-time staff for various administrative functions. The work wasn't particularly challenging intellectually, but it paid well above minimum wage and offered flexible scheduling that could accommodate someone pursuing education. More importantly, it would give Harper exactly the kind of exposure to legal practice that she was seeking. "Harper," Usha said carefully, "how would you feel about working at my law firm? We frequently need help with document organization, filing, basic research, and client communication. It's not glamorous work, but it would provide steady income and give you first-hand experience with legal practice." Harper's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like cautious hope. "Are you serious?" she asked. "You'd be willing to hire me despite my situation?" "I'd be willing to consider hiring you based on your qualifications and potential," Usha corrected. "Your situation is temporary circumstances, not a reflection of your capabilities or character. But there would be practical requirements we'd need to address first. Stable housing, professional clothing, reliable transportation to the office." The offer hung between them, loaded with implications that both women understood. For Harper, it represented not just employment, but validation of her potential and a pathway into the legal world she desperately wanted to join. For Usha, it meant taking a significant personal and professional risk by vouching for someone whose background she knew only through a single evening's conversation. "I would work harder than anyone you've ever hired," Harper said intensely. "I know you'd be taking a chance on me, and I wouldn't let you down. This opportunity, it's exactly what I've been hoping for, but never thought would actually happen." The sincerity in Harper's voice was unmistakable, and Usha found herself increasingly convinced that this was the right decision despite its unconventional nature. Harper's combination of intelligence, motivation, and life experience would bring valuable perspective to the firm, and her gratitude for the opportunity would likely translate into exceptional performance. "Let's talk about the practical steps," Usha said, shifting into the problem-solving mode that had served her well throughout her legal career. "Housing is the most urgent need. Do you have any preferences about location or living arrangements?" "I just need something safe and affordable," Harper replied. "A room in a shared house would be fine, or a studio apartment if that's financially feasible. The most important thing is having a legitimate address and a secure place to keep my few possessions." Usha made more notes, mentally reviewing her knowledge of local housing resources and rental assistance programs. There were organizations in Cincinnati that specialized in helping young adults transition from homelessness to stable housing, and her firm had worked with several of them on pro bono cases over the years. "I think I can help with that," Usha said. "There's a non-profit called New Horizons that provides transitional housing and support services for young adults in situations like yours. I've worked with their legal department on tenant rights cases, and I could make some calls to see about expediting your application." Harper pulled out her notebook and began writing down the information, her movements quick and precise. "New Horizons," she repeated. "I think I may have heard of them, but I didn't know they had programs for people my age." "They do, and they also provide job training and educational support," Usha continued. "The housing is subsidized based on income, so it would be affordable even on an entry-level salary, and they have partnerships with local colleges for students pursuing degrees." The pieces of a comprehensive support plan were beginning to come together in Usha's mind. Housing through New Horizons, employment at her firm, educational support through community college partnerships, and mentorship to help navigate the complex path toward legal education. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, but it was a realistic pathway that could address Harper's immediate needs while supporting her long-term goals. "What about transportation?" Usha asked, continuing to work through practical necessities. "Do you have a driver's license?" "I do, but no car," Harper replied. "I've been using public transportation and walking. The bus system in Cincinnati is pretty good, and I've learned the routes that connect most of the places I need to go." "That's workable for now," Usha said. "Our office is downtown, easily accessible by bus. And once you're earning regular income, purchasing a reliable used car becomes a realistic goal." As they talked through these practical details, Usha found herself feeling increasingly optimistic about Harper's prospects. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable when Harper was facing them alone became much more manageable when approached systematically, with adequate resources and support. It was a reminder of how much difference access to social and economic capital could make in someone's life trajectory. "There's something else we should discuss," Usha said, shifting to a more serious tone. "If you're going to work at my firm, even in an administrative capacity, you'll need to understand the importance of confidentiality and professional conduct. Legal work involves sensitive information about clients' personal and business affairs." "Understand," Harper replied immediately. "I've been reading about attorney-client privilege and professional ethics as part of my legal studies. I know that everything I might see or hear in a law office would be strictly confidential." The fact that Harper had already educated herself about professional ethics impressed Usha but didn't surprise her. Everything about their conversation had demonstrated Harper's serious commitment to understanding legal practice comprehensively, not just the academic theory, but the practical and ethical dimensions as well. "Good," Usha said. "There would also be expectations about appearance and behavior that reflect the firm's professional standards. Nothing unreasonable, but clients expect a certain level of formality and competence from everyone they interact with in our office." "It would need help with professional clothing initially," Harper admitted. "Everything I own is either too casual or too worn for office work. But once I'm earning income, building an appropriate wardrobe would be a priority." Usha made another note about professional clothing, already thinking about resources that could help with that immediate need. Many organizations provided professional attire for people transitioning into employment, and several women's groups in Cincinnati specifically supported young women entering the workforce. "Let me ask you something," Usha said, leaning back in the booth and studying Harper's face. "This all sounds very promising, but I want to make sure you're comfortable with the pace we're discussing. We're talking about potentially changing your entire life situation within a matter of weeks. That can be overwhelming, even when the changes are positive." Harper considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately enthusiastic. "It is overwhelming," she admitted. "For the past year, I've focused on day-to-day survival, with these bigger goals seeming like distant dreams. The possibility of actually pursuing them feels almost too good to be true." "That's a completely understandable reaction," Usha assured her. "But I want you to know that this isn't about creating dependency or putting you in a position where you owe me something you can't repay. This is about recognizing potential and providing the kind of support that everyone deserves when they're working toward meaningful goals." "I've never had anyone believe in me like this," Harper said quietly. "I mean, some teachers encouraged me when I was younger, but they were working within a system that couldn't really help with my family situation. This feels different, like someone is actually willing to invest in my future." The vulnerability in Harper's voice reminded Usha of how isolating Harper's experience must have been, to spend months pursuing ambitious goals without any external validation or support required extraordinary inner strength and self-confidence. The fact that Harper had maintained her focus and optimism despite facing such challenges alone spoke to a resilience that would serve her well in any career she ultimately chose. "You've proven that you believe in yourself," Usha pointed out. "You've been investing in your own future every day, studying constitutional law under streetlights and researching educational pathways while managing the stress of homelessness. All I'm offering is some practical support to help you build on the foundation you've already created." Harper smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Usha had seen from her all evening. "When you put it that way, it doesn't seem too good to be true," she said. "It seems like the logical next step in a plan I've been working on for months." As their conversation wound down, Usha felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment or personal recognition. This chance encounter had reconnected her with the idealistic motivations that had drawn her to law in the first place. The belief that legal knowledge and professional networks could be tools for justice and opportunity rather than just wealth accumulation. "So what happens next?" Harper asked, consulting her notebook one final time. "What's the timeline for these various pieces coming together?" "Tomorrow I'll make some calls," Usha said decisively. "New horizons about housing, my firm's administrator about employment possibilities, and some contacts about professional clothing and GED registration support. If everything moves quickly, we could have you in stable housing within 2 weeks. And starting work shortly after that." Harper carefully wrote down the timeline, her movements precise and deliberate. "And the GED exam? We'll get you registered as soon as you have a permanent address," Usha confirmed. "With your obvious intelligence and self-directed study habits, I'm confident you'll pass easily. That opens the door to community college enrollment for the spring semester." The plan they had developed over dinner was ambitious but realistic, addressing Harper's immediate needs while creating a pathway toward her long-term goals. Most importantly, it respected Harper's agency and dignity while providing the practical support that could make the difference between dreams and achievement. As they prepared to leave the diner, Usha realized that this evening had changed her, as much as it might change Harper. She had rediscovered the satisfaction that came from using professional success to create opportunities for others, and she had been reminded that the legal profession's highest calling was service to justice. Rather than personal advancement, Harper carefully wrapped her constitutional law textbook in its protective plastic covering and tucked her notebook into her backpack. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the meal, for listening to my story, and for seeing possibilities instead of just problems. Thank you for reminding me why I became a lawyer in the first place," Usha replied, meaning it completely. "I have a feeling this is the beginning of something significant for both of us."